you wanted to defeat an enemy fleet of, say, a dozen battleships, you had to bring a fleet of a dozen battleships. If you wanted to face an enemy that had, 100 heavy tanks, you needed to field a similar force. That is being broken today for the first time, probably, in human memory, whereby a small, inexpensive precision weapon now can reliably destroy a much larger and more expensive target. So you don't need to stick with what had been the maxim for decades, that the best weapon of a tank is another tank. Now, oftentimes, the best weapon of a tank is either a shoulder-fired missile or even an FPV drone, right? And that's bringing us to this point of weapon target asymmetry that you talked about, which is driving a lethal precision battlefield where those larger traditional platforms that we're used to just can't survive anymore. It's not happening overnight, but as we can see in Ukraine, it's definitely not happening slowly either. It's in progress.
Today's episode sponsor is Aditon, creators of Aditon Operations Kit, the military's go-to software for personnel and equipment accountability. AOK goes where you do, any network, anytime, any place. I got to know Aditon's co-founders, James and JJ, several years ago. They are former Army NCOs who have years of experience in the tech industry. They understand that most military jobs aren't performed behind a computer desk. Personnel and operations are distributed, but accountability of property is paramount to making mission. That's where Logi, AOK's equipment management software, comes into play. Formerly known as 92X, Logi is a next generation of equipment management for the military. Logi offers unrivaled features for military teams on the go. Ingest and digitize your primary and sub-hand receipts. Generate and share sub-hand receipts and DA forms with your team in just a few clicks. Capture photos, tags, and notes across your team to build context on the state of equipment. Get easy on-the-go access to critical property records. Logi is custom built for the modern military professional. It gives you your valuable time back so you can get back to the mission at hand at home or in the field. Whether you're doing monthly inventories or preparing for deployment, Logi is your pocket property book, giving you real-time visibility into equipment status and mission readiness. Logi is currently in use across the U.S. Army Special Forces, and it's expanding. For a limited time, listeners of the From the Green Notebook podcast can try out Logi for free. Visit aditonppbc.com/FTGN-Logi to get started. That's ADYTONPBC.com/FTGN-LOGE. How do I know what I think until I see what I say?
The Green Notebook, carried by military leaders around the world. Within those pages are sweat, tears, triumphs, and the hard-won lessons of life. Lessons worth sharing. Each week, the team dives into the notebooks of military leaders, business professionals, authors, athletes and coaches, and entertainers to share lessons and help you lead with the best version of yourself.
Welcome to another episode of From the Green Notebook. I'm your host, Joe Byerly, and today we're opening up the Green Notebook of George Dougherty. George is the author of Beast in the Machine, How Robotics and AI Will Transform Warfare and the Future of Human Conflict. And it's a book that examines how technologies and precision weaponry are transforming the battlefield. Now, I read this book last month, and I've been telling everybody I've spoken with, they have to pick up a copy of this book because it's going to make you ask lots of questions, namely, are we ready to fight the next conflict? And in this conversation, we explore themes that are reshaping the character of warfare today. The history of military robotics, which stretches back more than a century. How universal precision and weapon target asymmetry are rewriting the rules of maneuver. Why we may be in a maneuver crisis akin to the trench warfare of the First World War. And the ethical dilemmas of democratizing technology that once belonged only to nation states. Now, George challenges us to think beyond incremental improvements and instead reimagine what future platforms and tactics might look like. His insights will push you to see connections between history, innovation, and the responsibility of today's leaders. Now, whether you're a soldier on the ground, a policymaker shaping defense strategy, or simply someone curious about the future of conflict, this episode is for you. It's a fascinating, sobering, and serious look into the technology that is redrawing the battlefield. So grab your green notebooks and please welcome to the show, George Dougherty.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I'm really glad to be here.
So I used to read books all the time on war and warfare. And I remember one in particular called Combined Arms Maneuver by Jonathan House. And the one thing he talked about is every time you have a new weapon, that there's always a counter weapon that gets developed. And people always think that single weapon will change warfare. But the book Beast in the Machine isn't a weapon, it's a technology that affects every aspect of the battlefield. And I'm excited about this conversation because I see this as I was reading, as I was highlighting and thinking through things, how much this is going to change the character of warfare.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a change that's really bigger than I think a lot of people let on. I think the point you're making is exactly right. Too many of us still think of this as yet another technology like night vision or jet propulsion, but it's much more comprehensive than that. It really is as big as the onset of mechanization and industrialization at the beginning of World War I. It's that comprehensive, and it could be that far-reaching in terms of its implications on the military and beyond the military.
Yeah, and so speaking of that, let's back up a little bit. You mentioned World War One. I'd like to, when I'm thinking of robotics, I only think of it in terms of the war on terror. I think of the Predator. I think of EOD. I think of all those things. But this history goes back well before, correct?
Oh yeah, yeah. It's actually surprising how far back it goes, and all the lessons that we can take from that history. One of the things that I found early on while researching this book was that there is so much more rich actual combat history than most of us know about, and that even those of us who work in the field aren't, in many cases, aware of all that's gone before. So, and it's not just interesting from a historical standpoint. For instance, by going back and looking at that history, we realize that almost all of the concepts for robotic weapons that we hype today really are just additional implementations of the same three basic concepts that were all proposed more than 100 years ago, right?
Wow.
Like Nikola Tesla came out with the first mobile robot, which he called the teleautomaton, and he showed it at Madison Square Garden. And you can imagine in 1898 the wows and the gasps of this artificial beast roaming around on its own and seeming to react to his commands. But that remote controlled teleautomaton, he said the most obvious application for it is going to be in armaments and warfare. So pretty much the idea of military robots is as old as the idea of robots themselves. And that remote controlled teleautomaton, if you will, is basically what we see today in terms of our MQ-9 Reapers and remote controlled and remotely piloted ground and air and sea vehicles. And then the other two were the autonomous homing weapon, right, which was introduced in 1912, and then the aerial torpedo, which is basically the same thing as a cruise missile, very crude when it was first rolled out, but it was first rolled out in 1916. And so all of the things we've been doing since then are basically improvements on those three basic concepts. So the technology improves in ways that the inventors in the beginning could never have imagined, but the concepts really haven't moved forward necessarily all that much yet.
Well, before we talk about some of this new technology, what was the first time, or when was the first time that one of these robots was actually used in battle?
Yeah.
I think this is interesting.
Yeah. So surprisingly, that the first actual casualties imposed by a successful attack by an unmanned system was an attack by a German remote controlled explosive boat, not that different from the ones we're seeing in Ukraine today, on a British coastal patrol warship in 1917 off the coast of Belgium. So, so remote controlled explosive boats, which we think of as being one of the latest and coolest things to come from the Ukraine war, actually another idea that was not only thought of, but used in combat more than 100 years ago.
So again, now like fast forwarding to today and the development of robotics, development of AI, there's some new concepts that I think that we need to start thinking about, because when you think about them, it starts to generate ideas of tactics changing, structure changing. And the first one I want to talk about is this idea of universal precision. Could you explain what it is and, through your research, how you see it shaping the battlefield?
Yeah, so I think the big framing to put on this is that the situation we're in today, militarily and technologically, is actually pretty similar to the one that we were in at the beginning of World War One. Like I said, that was a transformational new broad technology that was being applied to military affairs. And in the first wave of that, what you saw, it was applied to fires, right? The machine gun, the heavy indirect fire artillery, those were advances in the lethality of fires that were the first things to which mechanization and industrialization were really applied. And what did we see when that happened, right? You had an increase of, say, 100x or more over in lethality over the similar types of weapons that existed in, say, in the Napoleonic model of warfare, which had prevailed in Europe up to that point. The weapons and their lethality, due to sheer firepower, had increased in their lethality by that degree. But the maneuver platforms of that time that were used to conduct offensive warfare, such as horse cavalry and massed foot infantry, had not evolved, right? And so what you saw was a tremendous imbalance of fires over maneuver. Those old-fashioned maneuver formations and platforms were just cut to pieces. And as a result, everything came to a grinding halt. And you had a static, attrition-based method of battle that prevailed for a long time. And in some ways, we're seeing the same thing today, except it's not sheer firepower now that's caused that leap. It's universal precision, or that is to say, the fact that we are now getting to the point where we're giving every type of weapon, not just a few laser-guided bombs or cruise missiles, but artillery shells, FPV drones, shoulder-fired missiles, even individual squad weapons, that one shot, one kill lethality. And that's increasing the lethality of all these battlefield weapons by another factor of 100x or more, and putting us back in the same situation, once again, that we were, where you've got tremendously more lethal fires ruling a battle space and basically shutting down maneuver by the platforms that were still from a generation before.
Yeah, and as before I retired, I was a cavalry squadron commander. So I grew up in the cavalry, most of my time spent in strikers. And from my time at JSOC and what I got to see in the first few months of the Russia-Ukraine war, this idea started popping up in my head that if we're making contact with human beings first, then we're basically doing something wrong. And so one of the things that like we were trying to do is experiment and create like almost like an intel fusion center at the brigade level, repurposing the cavalry squadron staff to kind of take in all these different feeds and make sense of it. So it's doing reconnaissance with robots, so to speak, instead of relying solely on a young scout out there out front. And I think there's still going to be a need for it, but I do think that as you're talking about universal precision and some of the other things that we're going to talk about today, that we're going to have to advance. And we're already seeing, I don't know if you know this, but cavalry formations have pretty much been cut out of light infantry and striker brigade formations. And so, we're heading that direction, but I think, it's really hard, especially when you grew up in it, to let it go. Like I imagine that 100 years ago that, the horse soldiers were getting upset during a mechanization when all of a sudden they realized they weren't able to get out in the battlefield and snoop and poop.
Oh yeah, yeah. That actually is a real piece of history. In the U.S., the head of the Cavalry Corps was asked to consider, I think it was by General Eisenhower, how to mechanize the Cavalry Corps back before World War II, and he studied it and thought the best thing to do would be to buy mechanized horse trailers for all of the horses to be able
Yeah,
to
yeah.
transport them to the scene of the battle. Didn't quite get the memo, so
No.
happily we didn't do that. But what you're saying is, I think goes back even to what you were talking about a moment ago about the precedents of history, because we think that making initial contact with unmanned systems might be a radically new approach, but most of us don't know for some reason why. Why I have no idea, because it is so very cool that the largest tank battle of World War II, and still probably the largest in history, the Battle of Kursk, the German offensive was spearheaded by unmanned robotic combat vehicles. They weren't super advanced. They were basically had the same technology as remote controlled cars today, but they were armed, and they actually formed that reconnaissance screen of breaching vehicles ahead of the main spearheads formed by the Tiger tanks and the Ferdinand heavy tank destroyers that actually led the entire German assault. They went out as remote controlled vehicles ahead of the main line of those armored spearheads and drew fire, revealed minefields, cleared those minefields remotely, took out anti-tank positions and other obstacles, and basically served both as that front line of breaching vehicles and as an armed reconnaissance force. And they worked surprisingly well, even for the primitive technology of their time. They advanced much faster than the German battle plan had expected. And the only problem they had was that they advanced so quickly that the supporting units, like the Second Panzer Division, were not in position to follow up their rapid breakthroughs. And second, then, that there were only a small number of them, just 3 companies, and they ended up expending all of their unmanned systems in combat in the first couple of days, and they ran out. They were attritable. They just didn't have enough of them in reserve to keep going at that rate. So if they had not run out, or if they had kept their follow-up echelons in position, we might have known unmanned systems as being famous for winning the greatest tank battle in history, even if it was for the bad guys. But instead, they petered out, and that rapid progress they made early in that battle was reversed by the Soviets. The Germans ended up losing, and everyone forgot about the role of unmanned systems.
Well, is again, the technology develops, and we talked about universal precision. How is that affecting weapon target asymmetry?
Yeah, so that's really something that's really fundamentally new here. If you go back decades, even centuries, it's always been the case that weapons and targets had to be more or less symmetric with one another. That is to say, if you take a ship, for instance, for naval combat for ages, smaller warships fared poorly in combat against larger warships, right? If you wanted to defeat a battleship, you really needed to bring a battleship to that fight. Similarly, a small tank had weapons that had trouble penetrating the heavy armor of a large tank. So tanks tended to get bigger and bigger to carry heavier weapons. And then, of course, other tanks had to get bigger to carry the heavier armor to protect them against those bigger weapons. And so you had military forces that in the aggregate were symmetric with each other, right? If you wanted to defeat an enemy fleet of, say, a dozen battleships, you had to bring a fleet of a dozen battleships. If you wanted to face an enemy that had 100 heavy tanks, you needed to field a similar force. That is being broken today for the first time, probably in human memory, whereby a small, inexpensive precision weapon now can reliably destroy a much larger and more expensive target. So you don't need to stick with, say, what had been the maxim for decades, that the best weapon of a tank is another tank. Now, oftentimes, the best weapon of a tank is either a shoulder-fired missile or even an FPV drone, right? And that's bringing us to this point of weapon target asymmetry that you talked about, which is driving a lethal precision battlefield where those larger traditional platforms that we're used to just can't survive anymore. It's not happening overnight, but as we can see in Ukraine, it's definitely not happening slowly either. It's in progress.
Yeah, what does that mean for like these defense basically the defense industrial complex? As like it made sense before, like a tank or even a striker, when you have parts being made all over the United States. But like we're seeing in Ukraine, it's a small FPV or a drone dropping a grenade on an enemy tank and destroying it.
Yeah, it's really going to be very disruptive to the defense industrial complex. We talked about how the battlefield situation is very analogous to what we saw in World War One, where the first wave was fires, right? I think the if we're going to prevail in this new world that we're starting to see, certainly the first thing is that we've got to get good at that first wave of combat, right? We can't allow our military just to be unprepared for that type of precision warfare at scale that our enemies are. But that's not going to last for very long, right? We don't want to get stuck in that attrition warfare type of hellscape that leads to. World War One was a miserable experience. Happily, we were only in it for a year or so. But I think you could ask all the Europeans that fought in that, they didn't ever want to do that again. Similarly, with even with other major world wars, but particularly for us, we do not want to get into a match of who can bleed the most with either China or Russia or any of our other competitors. And we hear the defense industrial complex using words like mass and scale and attrition right now, which kind of makes sense in the short term, but that's not the way we want to fight, right? It's not the way our military likes to fight, but more importantly, it's not the way our society is built to fight. Russia, for instance, loves to talk about how they can outsuffer their enemies, how they can take 1 million casualties like they have in Ukraine and just say, well, we got a lot of malingerers roaming around the country that we'd love to kind of take off the books anyway. We don't want to fight that way. And if it was bad enough with 20th century weapons like heavy artillery, 21st century weapons now that can have intercontinental range and so forth will make it much worse. So what we really need to do if we want to get out of that trap is push the military industrial complex to move on to that second wave, right? Which is, as we did in the interwar period between World War One and World War Two, we decided, hey, the way out of this is we need to think about how to reinvent those maneuver platforms that really fully embrace and express the fundamental potential of, in that case, mechanization and industrialization to come up with platforms like the airplane, for which there was never a horse-powered version of that possible before, right? It wasn't the horseless something. Similarly, we need to completely open the aperture and reimagine what our maneuver platforms could be like. And when we get to the point where we're not calling something an unmanned blank, something familiar, then I think we'll know we're getting there. But that's going to require a real effort, both from our military industrial complex and partnered with our military, right? Because if we look back to the 20s and 30s, it wasn't our industrial partners who came up with things like strategic bombing. That was the military that came up with that and told them, hey, can you build this? And I think we need to get back to that same place of thinking a few steps ahead and skating to where the puck is going, like Wayne Gretzky liked to say.
Yeah, and so World War One ended with a maneuver crisis with no man's land, and as during that interwar period, there was all sorts of innovation, like we were talking about, like the tank and all sorts of mechanization, the airplane, and you had junior officers like George Patton, Eisenhower out playing with the tank, thinking about new ways of using the tactics and stuff. But like one of the things that you argue in the book is that we are in a maneuver crisis right now. We're back in it, like you said, we're back in no man's land again, and we need to figure out a way to get out of it.
Yeah, it really is a crisis of maneuver. And there are arguments that say, hey, the tank isn't obsolete, right? It still has its uses. It just needs more support. It just needs support from infantry, support from air power, and so forth. That was the case. That nothing goes extinct overnight, and nothing is truly dead and gone until something else appears that can do the mission that platform used to be able to do, right? Like look at the battleship. The tank started out as the land battleship, right? In World War One, that was the original idea. But by World War Two, air power was threatening battleships already to the point that they were becoming obsolete, and we were building aircraft carriers instead. Now, they didn't go obsolete overnight. One of the things they did is they added lots and lots of more active defenses to them, right? So in World War One, there was the crazy idea that, hey, airplanes are just little canvas toys. Stick a machine gun on the top of your cruiser to take care of any airplanes, no problem. But by the time World War Two came around, you found that you had to absolutely encrust your ships with anti-aircraft guns to stand any chance. Like the battleship Yamato, right, in its final configuration, carried 178 anti-aircraft guns, but it was still sunk by air attack. And we were still able to find a role for battleships here and there, like a couple of Iowa class battleships that still did good service all the way up into the Gulf War. But while they could do great things, the situations in which they could really be decisive just became fewer and fewer, and the additional support they needed in their case, of other ships in the battle group to protect them from missiles and so on and so forth became greater and greater, till at some point it just became impractical, right? So, the crisis of maneuver. Don't let the fact that somebody can say, "Hey, the Ukrainians just don't have enough good mobile infantry," or the Ukrainians just don't have enough air cover. That's true today, but we've already seen how far the needle has moved in 5 years or 3 years. We're still at the very, very early days of this, and there's a long, long way for this first wave of universal precision to run before we've actually finished saturating the battlefield. And it's the writing is on the wall. I'm not saying that we need to be doomsayers about this, or that it's about denigrating any branch of the military. I think, in fact, all it is, it's an exciting time, but in a time that really requires us to go back to what we used to be really good at, and we can be really good at again, which is outthinking our adversaries, coming up with what the next generation of platforms is going to look like, finding out how to fight with them, and appearing with them in the battle space before they've had a chance to even start the thinking process.
Well, you said what our platforms are going to look like. Do you see this changing? This advanced technology changing like our vehicle design, what it looks like, how many people get in a vehicle, like et cetera?
Oh yeah, yeah. I think if we're going after the consequences of weapon target asymmetry and redesigning our platforms to get after that second wave, there are a lot of things that we can do, and a lot of them are enabled by that same robotic and AI enabled technology that's causing the pressure in the first place. We just need to fully embrace it. For instance, look at the platforms we have today. Simply removing the human element of them, which we can do now, and making them into those forward elements that are controlled by humans, not necessarily fully autonomous, which has its own problems, which we talk about in the book. But at least making a lot of the platforms unmanned opens up the design space tremendously. And I'm not just talking about removing some people and saving some internal space, but if you think about something like a frigate, right? It's not just that you've got a lot of space inside dedicated to the human crew. Usually it's about 25%, but almost all the other space on the ship is really built around the needs of that crew. I'm talking about the fact that there's a bridge, right? The fact that there's a horizontal deck that people can walk on, and internal passages, and all these other kinds of things. If you take that away, or let's say open up that design space, whether it's for sea platforms, ground platforms, even air platforms, you can release what I like to think of as a Cambrian explosion of new possibilities that really allow that space to open up. That's one dimension. And the other is the dimension of dissociation, right? One of the few really new concepts that's come about in the past couple of decades is the concept of swarms, right? Everybody thinks about those now. It's become almost a little bit hackneyed in the way they're portrayed. But what that really is the ability to dissociate a platform into separate sub-platforms or elements. There's no reason why things have to physically be connected to each other anymore, which basically now combines them all together into one big platform that's conveniently gathered for easy destruction, where everything can be sunk at once, right? You can separate those out into separate platforms like drones in a swarm, but that gives you the ability to withstand almost any weapon, because all you could do is take out one or part of the swarm at a time, and offer a tremendous other range of capabilities that I think we'll talk about when we talk about the atmospheric littoral. But the important thing is that when you dissociate, it sounds very, very futuristic, but it's actually a very old concept. If you think about a regiment of infantry, that's basically a dissociated unit, right? It's a unit that moves and fights as a unit, but all the individual soldiers are separate elements. That's really all we're talking about going back to. So what's very futuristic is sometimes something that's actually very proven.
Yeah. So like when you say that dissociative, what does that look like in practice? Like, could you just give an example of what you mean?
Yeah, so let's go to the concept of the atmospheric littoral operations, which I think is that swarm concept, which I think is really evocative. I introduced that both the concept of the atmospheric littoral itself as a regime of operations, that low altitude airspace, and the use of small drones and other unmanned systems to dominate it. I came out with that in 2019. At the time, it was very hard to publish in that space. These are some of the Defense Journal articles, and it was pretty funny because some said, "Oh, that's not a thing. You can't publish on something that's not a recognized term of art." But now, 5 years later, there are entire journal issues devoted to that subject, whether it's called the atmospheric littoral or the air littoral or the air ground littoral. Now everybody's talking about it because they can see that it's becoming real from what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah.
That's how fast things can move.
And real quick for those that like just to conceptualize this, because like when we think robots, we think, like Terminator, whatever, like walking on the ground. We think about the dogs, we think about like track things. And if you think about it, and any time that you've ever played with any of these things, even a vehicle gets stuck very easily, but you just raise it a little bit off the ground, and then all of a sudden the world opens up. You've got a lot more maneuverability back. And so again, reading this and thinking about it and what this would look like, it changes everything. It changes how we fight, and it changes like the things that you need to be worried about as a soldier on the ground when you've got all these objects, that are able to own, to have dominance over that particular space. And you can correct me, George, but it's like from basically from just 10 feet off the ground, right, to all the way up to like was it like 300 feet?
Yeah, I think different folks have tried to make a different definition. I really prefer the tactical definition, which is not defined by a certain number of feet, but really about being intimately engaged in the ground fight, the way another, ground element might be. If you are 10 feet off the ground or 10 meters off the ground, for all intents and purposes, you're still in the midst of the ground fight, right?
Right.
Even from a distance, you might not even be obvious to anyone without using binoculars or something, whether you were touching the ground or not. But those 10 meters can make a tremendous difference. If we think about those types of systems, let's say combat drones, not as a small form of air power, right? When you're thinking about them as dropping bombs on things or utilizing them for precision fires, but think about them through the lens of a maneuver asset to a ground force commander. You're talking about a maneuver asset that, because it's moving slightly over the ground, now has achieved something that we've dreamt of for thousands of years, which is basically immunity to terrain. You can cross directly over minefields, directly across anti-tank barriers or anything like that, even across water barriers. They all mean nothing anymore. And also, because you could maneuver in 3 dimensions, you're not strictly limited to maneuvers in that 2D space. You can now do things that, for instance, the thinkers who came up with air assault were talking about vertical envelopments. They weren't really doing vertical envelopments with air assault units, but now you really can, right? You have sustained presence by armed drones and other modern day capabilities that are becoming very, very real, where you could now think about going up and over intervening buildings and things like that, creating a pincer movement or an envelopment that actually is formed in the vertical dimension as well as the horizontal dimension. In the book, we go into this in a lot more detail, where all the different tactical advantages and maneuvers can be translated and up-leveled using maneuver platforms that are in the atmospheric littoral. And that could blow the entire maneuver space wide open for U.S. dominance again, if we can get there first.
I'd like to introduce you to our newest partner, Roger Bank, a modern digital military bank built by military members for military members. Whether you're stationed stateside or overseas, Roger is designed to meet the unique needs of our men and women in uniform. I recently opened an account myself, and the process was incredibly smooth. It took less than 10 minutes from start to finish. Now, here's why I'm excited to partner with Roger. They offer high-yield checking and savings accounts, zero account fees, early payday, and automatic savings with Roundup Match. Their military-ready direct deposit form is even auto-populated and signed by the CEO, saving you time and hassle. Plus, you get free global ATM access, real person customer support, and they even offer accounts for service members as young as 17. Funds are FDIC insured through Citizens Bank of Edmond, so you can bank with confidence and peace of mind. Visit roger.bank to learn more. That's ROGER.bank. I got a question. I was walking the other day and it was like it was just a downpour. And I was thinking like all the times that, we had some sort of drone or had ISR and it was the weather completely ruined it. I mean, wouldn't that still be a factor? Like let's say we're fighting in Eastern Europe in the winter and the weather conditions are just horrible. Do you think that'll be, like that will get used, the use of drones will get shut down, or, will we develop the technology to where it gets to a point where it doesn't matter?
Yeah, well, that is really important, right? And I talk about a little bit in the book about how that's one of the things that sometimes when we come up with futuristic concepts, we don't always think about war in its real, messy, ambiguous, and oftentimes really physically unpleasant environment, right? When we go back to that case of these Borgvard B4 vehicles in the Battle of Kursk and others in the Eastern Front in World War II, they did tremendous things in certain battles, but like you're saying, they tried to deploy them to North Africa, where they really didn't like the blowing sand and heat, and they deployed them to the northern front of Russia against Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. They really didn't like freezing mud and deep sub-zero temperatures either. And some of those systems were more simple and more rugged than modern AI, powered systems and much more fine robotics. I think we're gonna have to anticipate that it's not just going to be Ender's Game or a robot soccer tournament out there, right? It's always going to be muddy, messy, cold, rainy, and so on. And there are good solutions to all those things, right? We're already coming up with a lot of surprisingly good and robust methods to allow robots and their control systems to handle those kinds of things. But I think we need to be very sanguine about that and put a lot of research into it, because right now you've got a lot of folks who are eagerly rushing in, perhaps Leroy Jenkins style, into military AI without necessarily having the same horse sense that you have about what it's like out there. And but I think our history can once again guide us towards the types of systems that can actually handle that environment and those that are not going to handle that environment.
So, quick history lesson for our younger listeners. There's a video that was shown in all sorts of military schools. It's a clip from the World of Warcraft, and what he's talking about is this one character. These folks are planning to attack something, and this one character, whose name is Leroy Jenkins, goes running into the next room. So I used that a couple of times in command, and people just stared at me, George. So I learned that reference does have a half-life, and we're on the other side of it. But look up Leroy Jenkins if you have no idea what George is talking about, and you will laugh.
Yeah, it's a few years old, but it's a great example.
Yeah, so the other thing that I was thinking about, you talk about AI, I'm thinking about the speed at which all this is happening. So what role are data networks going to play as AI, as all these sensors start to proliferate the battlefield?
Yeah, that's huge. When we look at things in Ukraine, what you usually see is videos, things that you can see changing on the battlefield, both from the way that forces are presented and the fact that the battlefield has become almost empty of visible forces, even though there's a raging battle happening. Anything that you can see is basically a target getting the snot beat out of it by precision weapons. But the battle of the networks, and also basically of the whole ISR networks on both sides, is the part that you don't see, and that's equally challenging. We talk about the kill chain, right? That's the process of finding, fixing, and finishing a target. You get modern versions of the kill chain that are like F2, T2, EA. Some of us may have heard about, but the whole point is that those are all the different steps. But in any description of the kill chain, the actual engaging of the target, that finishing step, which is the actual kinetic step, is just one of all of the other steps. Every other step has to do with things like finding, fixing, tracking, and those have become the hard parts when you get to the precision weaponry. In the past, oftentimes you just use indirect fires against a map coordinate and just try to hit anything that might be there sight unseen, right? But that is why we used to expend 100 or 1,000 or more shells or rounds to get every enemy casualty statistically. But now, when you've got single shot precision, you've got to have a tremendous amount of precision targeting data to guide each one of those weapons, especially if it's not eyes on target from the shooter themselves. So, we're already seeing that example in Ukraine again, right? There's a raging battle for ISR with all of the surveillance drones that are in place, but also aircraft. We're feeding a lot of data to the Ukrainians. The Russian surveillance aircraft are feeding a lot of data to their side. We've got space assets involved. You've got a heck of a lot of electronic warfare being engaged. The electromagnetic spectrum is a great way to find and fix a target, sometimes better than the visual. To the point that today, if someone is on the front line and has got a cell phone with them, all they have to do is turn that cell phone on, and sometimes they've got incoming fire on their location. It's pretty dramatic how much you have to practice electromagnetic hygiene in order to survive on that modern, developing precision battlefield. But I think you're going to see in the future that battle of networks, the battle both to be able to connect one's own forces and keep that connection going, at the same time while trying to take down the adversary's network to blind them and break their forces back up into individual, unconnected, uncoordinated elements, is going to become another center of gravity. I think it's already there today. Right now, we fight that way, but not all of our other enemies are yet. But if you look at Ukraine, what we spend billions, maybe even hundreds of billions of dollars doing with all of our three-letter agencies and space assets and so forth, they're able to do on the cheap with their Delta software, basically taking data feeds from small drones and observations from every forward trigger puller in their military, and basically combining that all into an integrated common situational awareness picture. It doesn't really cost that much money if you do it using commercial-based software and so on. That's something we're going to expect all of our adversaries to start doing in the future. So that battle of networks is going to become a two-way battle in the future, and we can expect to see that even more heavily contested throughout the coming decades.
Something else I was thinking of, it makes our server farms even that more vulnerable, to targeted attack. Do you see us as this becomes a greater part of future war, that we're going to, the Amazon servers somewhere are going to have military protection around them?
Oh, yeah. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book for everyone, including the general public, because for reasons just like that, we're not going to have rear areas to the same extent that we used to. It used to be that, unless you were in the military or knew someone who was, what was going on in a place like Iraq or Afghanistan was kind of something you'd read about in the papers, but otherwise didn't involve you, because of things like we're seeing with, for instance, Operation Spiderweb in Ukraine, right? That was the operation where covert shipping containers full of FPV precision strike drones were positioned deep inside Russian territory. Those small drones came out, were remotely piloted, and conducted precision FPV attacks that took out a good chunk of Russia's strategic air power, right, in one day. They could easily have gone after other targets, right, like server farms, wherever they thought their command and control was being maintained out of. They could also have easily gone after, if they had been so inclined, civilian targets, right? The Russians, Chinese, potentially. A lot of our adversaries don't fight clean the way that we do and go after purely military targets in a very scientific way. The Russian military, for instance, loves to just bludgeon their enemies, whether they're civilian or military, in these brutal counter-value type attacks against hospitals, markets, other places. A lot of times their theory of victory is simply make their population suffer so much that they will scream for, to sue for peace, whether they win on the battlefield or not. And if they were to have the weapons to use against us in that kind of a mode, it would be a very bad situation for us. So I think you're going to see a lot of those kinds of a lot of those kinds of rear area attacks, unfortunately, become a lot more feasible and a lot more available to a lot more forces.
Well, I appreciate your positivity, George. You know, along those lines, like if you were to look, industrialization, it changed cities forever. As you talk about in the book, there's been weapons that changed the political landscape of the world. Like even in World War II, if after World War II, you have to quickly mobilize the military to the ports. You have the Eisenhower highway system, which greatly changed the social aspects of America. So, like, do you foresee this AI and the robotics, I don't want to say revolution because that just means it's going back to the way things were, but this evolution kind of changing the way society looks moving forward?
Oh yeah, yeah. Things where history gives this fascinating context, right? There are some great examples that are they're very illustrative, but also pretty funny. If you go back to the 1900s, that last change of the century before this past one, there were a lot of newspapers and other places that asked for futurists of the time to envision the world of the 21st century, and they were they oftentimes extrapolated their what seemed very advanced to them in a way that was pretty strange. Like they showed future air warfare, that air warfare is going to become very important 100 years in the future. And so they showed things like blimps with cannons sticking out the sides, like they were old-fashioned pirate ships, having air battles, just like you might have a naval battle back then. They showed future airmen, which were basically humans with canvas-like bat wings on their backs, zipping around, shooting at each other with pistols. So, the things that they showed technologically were kind of anachronistic, and they didn't talk about how fast things changed. But the things that were even more impressive was they did not conceive, regardless of how futuristic their weapons concepts were, that the world in which those wars were going to be fought was going to change as much as it did. Right? Every one of those futuristic visions of the 21st century still shows, the British Empire and the men and women strolling along the boulevards under their parasols and so forth. Except now they're using, they're being patrolled by policemen of the air flying on their canvas wings rather than on the ground. But they didn't conceive that in 100 years, hey, the British Empire is not even going to be there anymore. So the social changes that are coming along with all of this are going to be much greater still. I think one of the examples I talk about in the book and go through is the influence that the coming of gunpowder weapons had on late medieval Europe. It started out being something on the battlefield, but it turned out that the idea that you could give a commoner, a peasant, a foot soldier, a weapon that with the pull of a trigger could take down a knight riding on horseback, who was basically, the tank of his day, that leveled out the social structure to the point that it eventually ended up in that entire feudal system of Europe falling apart. You couldn't ever justify why everyone had to be a serf when they could stand their own in battle and basically rebel effectively when they couldn't before. That changed the entire face of Europe, it led on to the Renaissance and the modern world, the Enlightenment, as kind of a snowball effect. And we could see the same thing happen now in various ways. We are putting really, really potent military capabilities into many hands that never had access to them before. And we can imagine that there are going to be some consequences that may be bad, but maybe good. But it's likely to create a snowball effect that can affect things far beyond military affairs alone.
Yeah, and there's a point that you talk about here, and I think it's worth focusing a little bit on is ethics. And so if you go to West Point, duty, honor, country. If you go to the Naval Academy, there's the honor system. I went to ROTC, and from the time I started there, the importance of integrity and ethics and right from wrong, all those things are just kind of ingrained in us. And I didn't really I don't think I could articulate it until I read your book. But because we are the tools of the state, we are the ones who carry the weapons, And so our ethical focus on being able to distinguish between civilian and combatant is so important. So that training matters. But with this democratization of technology that's happening right now, there is that risk. There's that tempest that this technology, just like the example you gave of gunpowder getting in the hands of average people, that all of a sudden we may come into an instance where the military is no longer in control of these things.
Yeah, yeah. You have to ask ourselves, how user friendly do you want really potent precision lethality to become, right? If you no longer need experts to be the intermediaries to use these things, like today, if you had a group that or a leader who wanted to go ahead and start some very ill-advised conflict, you say, hey, let's bomb them into the Stone Age. They couldn't do that themselves, right? You would have to ask the bomber crews to do that. And if they tried to do it themselves, they'd walk into the cockpit of a bomber and wow, that is a confusing situation to confront. Zillions of dials and controls. The military serves as actually in a lot of modern Western countries, especially, as a very civilizing and moderating force in the use of armed force to achieve ends, right? We've got that very, very professional mindset. But there are a lot of potential new entrants, let's say, into the market of violence that don't necessarily have that approach. When it comes to hopefulness, we've actually have been privileged to live in a time where, whether it's because of that professionalism of the military or because of the unique situation that we've been in the United States, where our unique position has allowed us to have almost a monopoly on high-end military power to create a Pax Americana. But we're living in a situation where the rate of casualties and deaths from violence and warfare is at the lowest point that it has been in at least the last 600 years. And anything that would really upset that is going to be worrisome, right? We would not want to go back to the situation that, in fact, most humans have lived in for a long time. We go to Europe today on vacation and we see those walled towns up on top of hills and we go, oh, so romantic. I want to go see that place. But they had to build walls around their towns and build them on the top of hills for a reason, right? It was a nasty and brutish world for a long time with a lot of different bad actors out there who could show up on your doorstep at any time. I'm not saying that we'll go directly back to that, but when we really democratize high-end military capabilities to the point that, our high-end systems like stealth aircraft and tanks could be taken out by something you can buy on the open market, that opens that market of possibilities perhaps wider than I think a lot of us would be comfortable with.
Yeah, I was actually, I've done 2 podcasts today. And the first one was a professor in London who wrote a book called The Collective Edge. And in one of the stories in there, he tells, it was like shortly after the War of 1812, and over in the area of like British Columbia, there was one of the San Juan Islands, a British citizen, somebody that belonged to the empire, and a U.S. citizen got into a conflict over a killing of a pig or stealing of a pig. Somebody got killed, a potato got stolen, some other stuff. But it ended up escalating to the point where the U.S. sent a company or a battalion out to protect the American family. And then the British sent warships to the island too. And the British commander actually refused an order to fire upon this. And basically, this guy was using it as an example of, when passions get inflamed, somebody who is trained on ethics was able to de-escalate it, to a point. And so I think it gets back to your thing, like with human nature, for 5,000 years, we've done some wild and crazy stuff, all because of passion, and this training for military leaders is so important to take a step back and to do the right things. It's more morally, legally, and ethically correct. And we run the risk of this getting out of control if it's not properly controlled, and if we're not thinking where this is headed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a real patriot in the sense that, I especially value the important ethical role that all of us in the military are trained to at a very high, from a very early age in our military training. You know, it is true that every graduate of every military academy is required to take a course in ethics before they can graduate. But you can get a degree in AI from any university without ever having to study ethics at all, right? And so I think maybe we're going to have to start making ethics much more broadly internalized if we're going to get to this point where we have technologists and tech bros and whatnot making decisions about the future of warfare, perhaps hopefully with the engagement of professional military officers and others, but especially if they don't, I think we're going to try to have to get others to see things through that same lens, because we don't want to go back to a world where that isn't the case.
Hey, I want to pause the episode for just a second because I want to tell you about an upcoming event you won't want to miss. The Red Thread House at the AUSA annual meeting this October in Washington, D.C. This episode is brought to you by Red Thread X, a team of industry leaders and veterans who partnered with us to make it happen. And if you're enjoying this conversation and want to go deeper, join George, me, and members of the Red Thread X team at the Red Thread House. We'll be exploring George's book, Beast in the Machine, and tackling the hard questions around the ethics of killing in war. Our panel and the broader Red Thread House program will wrestle with topics shaping the future fight: artificial intelligence, contested logistics, layered protection, and 21st century command and control. The Red Thread House is where ideas meet innovation and investment, creating a space to imagine a safer and more stable future together. This is an invitation-only event that takes place offsite from the main AUSA annual meeting on the 14th of October. So to learn more about attending, reach out to the Red Thread X team at info@theredthreadx.com. And you can find their address and more information about this event in the show notes for this episode. Well, in this interview, George, we talk mostly about robotics. And the only aspect that I want to touch on AI with you is, we're now everybody's using it for everything. Like all aspects of life are starting to get, more and more connected with algorithms. One of the things that I've been thinking about, and I recently had a conversation with a senior leader about, is the need for the user to be smarter than the algorithm. And I'll give you an example. So I was uploading interviews that I had done for some book research I'm doing. And I asked ChatGPT to create a transcription for me. And I'm going through and reading it. And there's a line in there that I don't remember the interviewee getting, asking or him saying. And as I dug into it and started asking about it, it was like, yes, it's in there. You talked about this. And it even changed it again. Like, sorry, we misquoted it. Here's what you actually said, which was also false. And so I had to go back and listen to the interview again. And sure enough, it wasn't in there. And I actually wrote in the prompt that wasn't in there. And it said, you caught me. So I was thinking, that's just a data point, a very small vignette. But I can imagine a commander getting an assessment, through the military decision-making process or the joint planning process. And something comes back even in the targeting process. And if you don't have that background, that tactical, technical knowledge, I would imagine that you run the risk of being not a slave, but being at the whims of an algorithm that's hallucinating. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that too.
Oh yeah, no, I think that's a really serious issue. It's what I call the risk of over-empowerment of AI, right? A lot of folks like to talk about the very hypothetical possibility of a conscious, super intelligent AI like Skynet, from the movies and so on. Most all of that we see today is really just an illusion that's drawn from the way that deep learning AI and generative AI works. It's basically reflecting us back at ourselves, not as individuals, but as as all the creators of the data that it was trained upon. That's why it looks like it's acting human, is because it's imitating human produced data and behavior that it's trained on. But there are a lot of real serious human biases that many of us are not conscious of that encourage us to over empower AI, whether it's magical thinking, just believing that AI is so incredible and so smart that it must be right, but also a lot of very measured and studied psychological phenomena like automation bias, right? It's even before AI came along, it was long known when you study the failure analysis of disasters at nuclear power plants and airline crashes and so forth, that humans have a real tendency to trust something that's information that's produced by an automated system, even if they know it can be wrong and that the system does nothing to check the data. Simply the fact that a light on a dashboard tells you that that you're flying straight and level will cause us to overrule the evidence of our own eyes that know we're headed downward. And there are a lot of other biases like that that are pretty insidious, but can affect even pretty well trained and sophisticated folks and cause us to do things that would not, create hypothetical super intelligent AI that's going to take over the world, but that set us up for the real danger, I think, which is empowering actual AI that is flawed with authority that it is not competent to handle. And if you look at all of those science fiction horror stories from 2001, A Space Odyssey, all the way to through the Skynet of the Terminator and many others, the real horrible part about it is not that the AI was really smart or really autonomous or advanced. It's really that we gave it way too much authority, and that was a mistake that we realized too late. So, over empowerment bias is something that I think we're going to have to be really careful about in the future, or we could set ourselves up for real disasters that don't require any kind of futuristic technology more than what we've already put in place.
No, and I continue, and until the technology gets even better, I view it as a very eager young second lieutenant staff officer who just wants to do a good job, but doesn't necessarily have all the pieces. And so as I'm working, I'm asking myself, like, would I listen to this person who doesn't have the experience that I do? Or do I need to like go back and kind of go back to some of my experiences and kind of suss some more out of it. But I think that's a really great point. And like you say in the book, that a sensor could be malfunctioning, somewhere in the network, and it won't even realize it. It'll still give you an assessment based on everything working properly.
Yeah, we've got a lot of senses that we take for granted that AI and robots don't have and probably won't have for a long time, right? You're talking about, if we feel sick, we feel like something's in our eye, we know not to trust that, or that we've got a diminished capacity, but there is no AI yet that can say, I don't feel well today. I think I'm going to beg out of, giving you an opinion on this. And AI doesn't know how much it doesn't know. For many of us, it's a process of maturity. The world sometimes seems really simple as a teenager, right? Everything is simple and a linear explanation for everything because you only know two things and a straight line connects them perfectly. Once you get to the point where you start to encounter things you don't know, it leads to a lot of humility and it causes you to say, hey, let's maybe take a step back before we give some advice or express an opinion on something that's too certain. But an AI doesn't do that. And so an AI can often be, as we say, confidently wrong. It'll tell you things like, yes, you said this when you didn't, but it'll fill the space that's available and come up with something if you asked it to.
Yeah. Well, George, as we wind down, I just want to say thank you so much for making time today. Again, this book, as I've gotten out, I haven't read a lot of books on war and warfare, and diving into this one just got my mind spinning on different possibilities, rethinking tactics, rethinking structure, rethinking vehicle design, thinking about the speed of war, what AI is going to do, what it won't do, limitations like we were talking about, like with the weather, like what's that going to look like. And so I think for practitioners, regardless of rank, by picking up Beast in the Machine, you will do the exact same thing. And I think that's what we really need right now. We're in that interwar period where we've got a new technology and we need leaders at all levels thinking about what is this going to look like and what do we need to start doing now. So again, George, thanks for writing the book and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, it's really been my pleasure. It was great talking with you, Joe. And I hope everyone will pick it up just because like I say, it's for practitioners, but it's also for everyone. And I think that we're seeing that in terms of the interest even from other countries. The Ukrainians are coming out with their translation of it. The South Koreans are as well. I think it's got really broad appeal. So if you buy it, it's not just a dry text. It's pretty exciting read, I think, and it'll keep you turning the pages. So it's a book for everybody, and I'm glad that I think it's the messages are getting through, because that's what's really important. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, George, and have a great day.
Oh, you too.
Thank you again for listening to another episode of From the Green Notebook podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please give us 5 stars wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps us gain visibility and the opportunity to help more people on their leadership journey. Also, make sure you check out our website at www.fromthegreennotebook.com. There, you can listen to past episodes, read leadership articles written by military leaders from around the world. You can sign up for our monthly reading list email where you can learn about new books that are coming out, and our Sunday reflection email that comes out every Sunday morning. Is really short. It's a 2-minute read, but I guarantee you it's going to start your week off on the right foot. Finally, make sure you follow us on Twitter at FTGN Notebook, and you can find us on Instagram and Facebook by searching for From the Green Notebook. Again, thank you so much for coming on this journey with us. I am humbled by the opportunity to learn these lessons alongside you. So please join us next week for another episode of From the Green Notebook, where we're going to help you lead with the best version of yourself.
I came from the mud. There's